This is the Canon Speedlite 199A. It's the dedicated flash for the Canon A1 film camera, which was introduced in 1978. Dedicated flash isn't a term that I hear very often these days, and even when I do, the definition is a little bit different to how it used to be. These days, Canon define a dedicated flash as an external flash that will work with a camera system. The EOS system being an entire system. So nowadays, if you buy any Canon EX flash and any Canon EOS body, the two will work together. But that didn't used to be the case in the film days. Back in the film days, you bought a camera body and then you bought the dedicated flash for that body. And that way you could be assured that every feature and function would work. The flash would work with other camera bodies, but all of the functions and features wouldn't necessarily work, and some things that would normally be automatic would have to be done manually. I enjoy making these videos because I used to use this equipment years ago and it gives me a chance to reminisce. I also enjoy looking at how technology has evolved over the years. And another reason why these videos might be useful is because a lot more people now are becoming interested in film again, and they may not know how to use some of this old equipment. What I'll be doing in this video is taking a detailed look at the 199A, showing you how to use it, and then looking at some sample images. With early cameras, everything was very mechanical and very manual. Everything had to be set manually, including the exposure. And flash photography was particularly difficult because you've got to think about it as being a kind of double exposure. There's the exposure of the ambient light, which is set by the aperture and shutter speed, and there's the exposure of the flashlight, which is set by the aperture and the amount of light that the flash produces. In some old movies you see cameramen with huge flashes on their cameras, and these things made a big pop, but there's no way that you could measure or control the amount of light from those flashes. It was only the skill and experience of the photographers that stopped the photos being horribly under or overexposed. By the 1970s, electronics had arrived, and automatic exposure in cameras of that era was quite common. And also flash units could regulate the amount of light they emitted and measure the light coming back, although it wasn't done the same way as it is today. So the light output from this flash can be varied between 1/1000th and 50,000ths of a second, and the light being reflected off the subject is measured using this sensor. Nowadays it's done through the lens, so the light comes back through the lens and is measured inside the camera, which then controls the flash. But that technology wasn't introduced until the generation after this flash unit. The head of the flash can be tilted for bounce flash. There are three fixed positions: 60 degrees, 75 degrees and 90 degrees. If you point your flash directly at your subject, the light can be a bit harsh, and by bouncing the light off the ceiling, this can reduce the harshness. There's also a wide angle adapter. Canon say that without the adapter, the flash can be used with lenses as wide as 35mm. But any wider than that, you need to use the adapter, and this is good for lenses as wide as 24mm. However, I have used the flash with a 28mm lens without the adapter, and it seems to be fine. When used with a suitable Canon camera, and maybe some other cameras, the flash couples to the camera through these three pins on the bottom, which make contact with the electrical contacts on the hot shoe. If you don't have those contacts on your hot shoe, you can connect the flash electrically using a sync cord, such as this. So this end goes into the flash, and the other end goes onto the sync socket in the camera. The A1 has a sync socket here, and after this, some cameras had them and some cameras didn't. My T90, which followed the A1, didn't have a sync socket. However, when I went to a digital SLR system, my 40D did have one. So your camera may or may not have one. Let's take a close look at the 199A, and firstly the power source, which is for AA batteries. I like AA batteries because they're so easily available, and I use Eneloop because the quality is good and I can recharge them. And then on the back is an on-off switch. So when the flash is charged and ready to go, this light illuminates red and then starts to flash. And if I press that button, it's the test light. So you should see the flash go off. And on this side, if I'm working in very dark conditions, I can press this button and it will illuminate this dial when the control's on the back, so I can see what I'm doing. And this also acts as the confirmation light. So the flash fires, light is reflected from the subject back onto this sensor, and provided that light is sufficient, this confirmation light will illuminate. This little switch here only works with the Canon A1. This highlights what I was saying earlier about this being the dedicated flash for the A1. It will work with other cameras, but some features and functions will only work with an A1. So if you put the flash on a Canon camera from the same era, it will set the shutter speed to 1/60th, and at the time that was the maximum sync speed for a flash. Nowadays it's normally 1/200th or 1/250th, but back then it was a lot slower. With the A1, if you put it on the manual mode, if you have the shutter speed on the camera set to 1/60th or higher, it will put it to 1/60th. However, if you put it to a lower shutter speed, it will use that lower shutter speed, whereas it won't in auto mode. In auto mode, if you set a lower shutter speed than 1/60th, it will put it back to 1/60th. The idea with the 199A was to automate as much as possible. But back then, technology hadn't quite reached the stage when everything was automated. So the first thing you need to do is a manual process. You need to set this dial to match your film ISO speed. I've been using ISO 200, so I'll set the dial to 200. And you have a little switch here, which has got one manual position and 3 automatic positions. And the automatic positions are color-coded, red, green and yellow. And dependent on your ISO speed, the flash will set the aperture on the camera to fixed values. So with ISO 200, if I put it in the red position, I will get an aperture of f4. In the green position, I'll get an aperture of f8. And in the yellow position, I will get an aperture of f16. There's also a distance scale on the flash. And by using this, it will tell me which aperture I can use. So for example, if my subject is 2 meters away, I can use any of those apertures. However, if my subject is 10 meters away, it tells me that I can only use the red setting, which will give me an aperture of f4. Your aperture, of course, will determine your depth of field. When using the flash in one of the automatic modes, it is essential to have the FD lens aperture ring on the A setting. Otherwise, the camera won't be able to adjust the aperture. The Speedlite 199A can be used with the Canon AV1, but the AV1 is an aperture priority camera, which means that you set the aperture on the lens and the camera sorts out the shutter speed. The AV1 cannot set the aperture on the lens. So if you use this flash with an AV1, you need to set the aperture manually, and you also need to put the flash into the manual position mode. The flash is quite easy to use, and you don't need to worry about settings on the camera. All you need to worry about is that you've got your lens set to the A position so that the camera can control the aperture. And the flash will set the appropriate shutter speed. If it's on the auto setting, it will always set the shutter speed to 1/60th of a second, and it will set the lens aperture according to the position of this switch. It's difficult for me to demonstrate, but when the flash is on the camera, switched on and ready to fire, you will see an F in the viewfinder to show you that it's ready to go. When you take a shot and the flash discharges, that F will go off momentarily, but after the flash recycles and it's ready to fire again, you will see the F. That means that you always know when the flash is ready to fire without taking your eye away from the viewfinder. When you have the camera in automatic mode, that means having the aperture ring on the A and using one of the A settings on the flash, the aperture that you see in the viewfinder will correspond to the setting on the flash unit, and that depends on the three colour codes. The shutter speed that you will see in the viewfinder most of the time will be 1/60th of a second. The only time you won't see that is if you're using a Canon A1, if you have this switch in the manual mode, and if you have selected a shutter speed slower than 1/60th. If you're using the camera and flash in manual mode, and that happens if you set the aperture ring on the lens away from the A setting, or if you set the flash to the M setting here, what you'll see is an M in the viewfinder for manual, and you won't see any aperture information. If the flash tries to set an aperture that is physically impossible, for example, it wants to set an aperture of f2.8 on a lens that only has a maximum aperture of f4, then the aperture will flash inside the viewfinder. It's then up to you whether you decide to ignore the warning or change the settings. This is the setup I'm using for these sample shots. I've put the camera on a tripod. It's my small Sirui tripod, which is very light and convenient to carry around. I'm using three lenses. On the camera at the moment is the FD 300mm f4. I'm also using the 28mm f2.8 and the 70-210 f4 zoom. And for the first photo, I'm not using the flash. The flash is off. I've just put the camera into shutter speed priority mode and selected a 60th of a second, and I've let the camera decide which aperture to use. The next three shots I'm using the flash in auto mode. I'm using ISO 200 film, so I've set the dial accordingly, and the red position gives me f4, the green f8 and the yellow f16. Although what I've found in practice is that in the red mode it often goes to f3.5. For the final shot I'm using the original settings that the camera wanted to use without a flash. I'm putting those in manually, and then I'm turning the flash on. So that way the background should be exposed perfectly because that's what the camera wanted, and the feedback from the flash should be sorting out the exposure for the subject. I used Kodak Color Plus 200 film and scanned it in using my Epson Perfection V600 photo scanner. There's a review on my channel if you're interested. In Photoshop, I just cropped and resized images for a video format, removed the little light streaks that you often get with film, applied a little bit of noise reduction and a little bit of sharpening. I didn't make any adjustments to curves, levels, colour, saturation or anything like that. Apart from some very minor noise reduction and sharpening, you're basically seeing the images as they came out of the camera. Of course, there's no white balance adjustment on a film camera, and the flash is set to a colour temperature of daylight. So when you start using the flash, you see quite a noticeable blue cast. As you reduce the size of the aperture, less ambient light enters the camera, and this blue cast becomes even more noticeable. The flash produces quite an unattractive blue cast on this particular image, so I think the best image is the first one, the one that didn't use flash. I enjoy playing around with old equipment, and this brought back some happy memories, but the more I play with film, the more I miss my digital camera. I had to carry around a notebook to write down all the exposure information, and of course with digital, that's all recorded within the film image. I love the fact that with digital you get instant feedback. So you take a shot, if something's wrong, you can dial in a bit more exposure compensation or flash exposure compensation. It's just so convenient being able to do that. With film, you can't do anything until the negatives come back from the lab, and if the whole thing was a disaster, you've got to go and do it all over again. And the image quality from digital is far superior. In fact, everything about film is inferior, and it's more expensive. Every 36 shots I take, I have to pay to get film developed, and then I have to pay to buy a new film. I still feel some nostalgia about film, but for me personally, there is no going back now. The results aren't great, but this is old technology. If you drove a car from 1978, it would be very different to driving a modern car. There was a big improvement in the generation of cameras after this one. The metering system in the A1 wasn't great, but the T90 had a fantastic metering system. Also, the 199A was quite a primitive flash, but the 300TL, which was a dedicated flash for the T90, was a much better unit and had proper through-the-lens metering. I have plans to do a similar thing for the T90 and the 300TL, and even though I'll be using the same lenses and the same film, I'm expecting the results to be a lot better. As ever, I hope this has been useful. If it has, please subscribe to my channel, and there'll be more videos coming soon. Thanks for watching.